All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today, a really incredible daf ahead of us today. Beginning by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, families who dedicated all of the Shiur Midrashos this month. Josh and Becca Friedman, creation of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda ben Rav Chaim Rafael, and for an aliyah for the neshamas of those murdered al Kiddush Hashem on Simchas Torah in Eretz Yisrael, and the schus of the safe return of our hostages and our soldiers, and refuah shalema for all those who have been injured. To thank Semi and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the Shiur Midrashos this month in memory of their parents, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, and Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram. The Pepper family, in memory of their brother and uncle Yosef Pepper, Yosef David ben Yaakov. Our week of learning sponsors, Dr. Ed and Faith Wolf, in honor of the marriage of their son Gideon to Mali Himorich. May the Chassan and Kala Me'arta Hashem be gebenched and build the Bayis Neman be Yisrael Mea Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. And of course, again, as a shir, we have dedicated Maseches Baba Kamma Li'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Elio Michal Charush, who died al Kiddush Hashem, defending the Jews of Sderot. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah and his family a nechama. But so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chaf Aleph 21, but we are picking up Baruch Hashem on 20. Chaf Amud Beis, and we left off. Yeah, it's a little embarrassing actually where we left off. All right, so you know what? If we're going to be embarrassed, then might as well own it. Let's just begin quickly again by the Tashma. Okay, I'm going to have to count from the lines down from the top. It is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, about 18, 19 lines down from the top. We actually did already some of this, but let's move through. It says the Gemara Tashma. So we'll say, so remember again, what's our overarching question? Excellent. Right? Again, what happens if you have a situation where Reuven is benefiting, Shimon is not losing, so is Reuven obligated to pay for his benefits? So for example, again, remember, Shimon has a home that he doesn't normally rent out. Reuven lives in that home, squats in that home. You know, it's a fine line. Right? So he goes ahead and he lives in that home. The shaila is, does he have to pay rent? At the end of the day, so Reuven is benefiting, but at the also Shimon is not losing. Why? Because it's a home that's not normally rented. So that's the sugya that we're in right now. So it says the Gemara Tashma. Remember the case. Habayis v'aliyah shel shnayim. You have Reuven and Shimon who live one on top of the other, right? They have a two-story home, and ultimately, again, Reuven lives on the bottom story, Shimon lives on the top story. What happened? So the Gemara says, Shenaflu, the structure collapses. Amr ba'aliyah, the balabayis. So again, Reuven, the lower level guy, says to Shimon, the upper story guy, I need you to rebuild the structure. But you know what? The truth is, Reuven's not in a rush. Because at the end of the day, look, Reuven has somewhere else to live. He doesn't need this. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, listen to this. Shimon has the ability to rebuild the entire structure and occupy both floors until Reuven decides to pay him for the expenses involved in building. Now, Gemara notes the interesting lo. What you see from here, both say something interesting. So ultimately, again, Reuven is obligated to go ahead and pay Shimon, ultimately, again, the value or the expenses. But what you see over here is that Shimon is not obligated to pay Reuven any type of rental. So what do you see from here? Shmamina, zenene, v'zelo chaser, pater. You see from here that when one party benefits and the other party does not in any way lose as a result of the first party's benefit, ultimately, again, there is no compensation obligated. No obligation for compensation. Tushmer says, no, that's a different case. Shiny Hassam, the base la'aliyah mishtabed. That's different, Aboseh, because inherent in a two-story structure is that the first story is mushubad to the second story. Obviously, because you can't have the second story ultimately again without the first. So because of that, essentially, the Gemara is asked, if Rashi says over here, sha'alabayis lisbal ha'aliyah hilchach hadin imzeh la durbo. So Aboseh, since the second story is mushubad, so to speak, the first story is subservient to the second story. Therefore, the relationship here is fundamentally different, and our particular issue of Zenen and Vizil Chaser is not shaykh. Tashma, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afze Hadar b'Chaser Chaver Shalom Yidai Totzarch Lalos Lo Schar. So we'll say, okay, so now Rabbi Yehuda quotes Rabbi Yehuda's quoting the Brisa. Then what happens if Reuven lives in Shimon's Chaser? Reuven lives in Shimon's Chaser without Shimon's knowledge. Reuven has to pay rent. What do you see from here? Shmamina zenene v'zelo chaser chayiv. Okay, so I'll say this seems to be pretty explicit. So you see from here, when one party benefits, the other party hasn't lost anything. The benefiting party still has to pay for their benefit. No, shiny hasam mishum shachreruse dash yasa. It's different. I will say in that case, the Brisa was talking about a case where what? There was wear and tear. There was wear and tear. So again, it's true, Ruvain is benefiting, and Shimon is not losing because Shimon doesn't rent out the space anyway. So it doesn't really matter to Shimon, but there's wear and tear. So because there's wear and tear, there's depreciation. So because there's depreciation, ultimately, again, there is a cost involved over here to Shimon, and therefore Ruvain has to pay. Shalchua be Rabbi Ami. Shalchua be Rabbi Ami Amar b'chi ma asalo uma chasro uma hazeko. At the end of the day, right? When you have this case of Reuven living in Shimon's property, so really, what did Reuven do? Rabbi Chia Amar, Rabbi Amar, Nisyashev Badavar. So listen to this. So remember again, they sent to Rabbi Ami this Shaila. Reuven lives in Shimon's property. It's a rental property. Shimon's not renting it out. So does Reuven have to pay rent to Shimon or not? So they sent this question to Rabbi Ami, and they said, in the question, I don't understand, why should Reuven have to pay? V'chima asa. What did he do? How did he cause a loss ultimately again to Shimon, and how was there any damage? So in other words, they were asking the question, and kind of, along with asking the question, were also kind of giving their own feeling of what the answer should be. So I'll say, listen to this. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar, Nisyashev Badavar. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, you know what? Let me think about it. Let me think about it a little bit. So Hadar Shalchua Kamed Rabbi Chia bar Abba. They sent the question again to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Amar Kule Hai Shalcholi Va'azli Ilu Ashkechi Bataima Lo Shalachnu Lahu. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, listen, why are you asking me again? Right? Asking me again is not going to bring me any closer to the answer. If I had an answer, I would have given it to you already. All right, so a little bit of Talmudic exasperation over here. Right? If I had the answer, I'd give it to you. If I didn't give you the answer, it means you don't have the answer yet. So the Gemara says, so Itmar, Rav Kahana or Rabbi Yochanan, so we'll say here it is. Rav Kahana said Rabbi Yochanan, Zenene v'ze'ino chaser, in a case where Reuven lives in Shimon's property. So Reuven is benefiting, but again, this is not a rental property. Shimon doesn't rent it out, so Shimon is not losing anything. Rav Kahana said in Rabbi Yochanan, Reuven doesn't have to pay rent. Rabbi Yochanan, no, he does have to pay rent. So we'll say this statement of Rabbi Avo, that namely again in the case of Zenene, V'zelo Chaser, that you do have to pay rent, wasn't stated explicitly. It was inferred from the following case. So we'll say, listen to this case. We'll say so much. What's incredible about this Gemara, Gemara's going to bring in like everything and the kitchen sink. Like it's incredible. Like everything's going to. It's one of these exciting dapim where you just get to see everything. The Gemara says as follows. So Rabbi Avo did not state his position explicitly, rather it was inferred. Where was it inferred from? Listen to this. Natal Evan Okoroshal Hekdish, Harez Elomal. Was an interesting case. If you take a stone or a beam belonging to Hekdish, the act of taking it is not in and of itself an act of Me'ilah. It's not an act of Me'ilah. Why did I say? Because remember, in order to commit Me'ilah, there has to be a Shinei Rishus, a change of domain, which we're really going to see means has to be a change in the object as well. So remember, who owns Me'ilah? Beis Hamikdash, which essentially means who owns me? Or who owns Me'ilah? Who owns Hekdish? Beis Hamikdash, which essentially means who owns Hekdish? Hakadosh Baruch Hu. So, in other words, it's still in the Ribono Shel Olam's Rishus, so you haven't committed Me'ilah. Nasna lechaveiro. If, however, you go out and you take the beam and you give it to your friend, hu ma'al b'chaveiro lo ma'al. So we'll say, so this case over here is I have an item that is Hekdish in my possession. So me taking it and lifting it is not Me'ilah. Me giving it to my friend, that is Me'ilah. However, so this is interesting. Let's say you take that beam and you build it into your house. You still haven't committed Me'ilah. When do you commit Me'ilah, Rabbi Say? After you build it into your house and get benefit from it. In other words, you'd have to live under that beam for some amount of time. Rabbi Shmuel says, I'm sorry, about Piaruba. So we'll say, so ultimately again he said furthermore, it's only, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, B'na'a gizbar b'soch beso. This is, Rashi says, this is about a case of the temple treasurer who takes a beam and builds it into his home. Ultimately again, he's also not chayiv until he actually lives under it. Rashi says, V'hu shehinicha Piaruba, v'lo kava b'binyan, t'lo havishinoi, hilchach lo ma'al ad shiyidir tachtel. So we're talking about over here where you place the beam on top of a skylight. So therefore, you're just putting it over an opening, but you haven't built it into the structure. In that case, you only commit me'ilah after you live under it, after you use it. Rabbi Avo, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Avo kameid Rabbi Yochanan v'kamar. Yes, Rabbi Avo kameid Rabbi Yochanan v'kamar. Mishvei d'Shmuel zos omeres hadar b'chatzer chaver shalom idaito tzarech lalos lo schar. So we'll say, so he inferred from this that what does it tell you? That if you live in your friend's property without his knowledge, you have to go ahead and pay him. Why did I say, how did you extrapolate that? Because the act of living under the beam of hektish is considered to be an act of me'ilah, for which there is chiyuv. So you see from here that the act of living, so to speak, in someone else's property is a quantifiable benefit for which you're obligated to pay. So therefore, based on that, when Ruvain goes to live in Shimon's property without Shimon's knowledge, even though again this is not a property that normally Shimon rents out, halacha l'maisa, Ruvain has to pay Shimon. Good. So the Gemara says, and when he said this, right, ultimately again, when he said this before Rabbi Yochanan was silent. So we'll say he thought Rabbi Yochanan's silence was Rabbi Yochanan's agreement. Velohi, not true at all. Ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan was silent. He was silent. He totally ignored the statement. I will say, by the way, there's a profound Musar Haskell in this, which is, he mentioned this actually a couple of weeks ago. I don't remember the context, but sometimes in relationships, often the worst thing is silence. Why? What do you see from this Gemara? Silence itself, the danger of silence, is that it could be interpreted in so many different ways. In other words, sometimes there's a problem in a relationship. The best thing to do is talk it out. But 1 second, it might come to yelling, it might come to screaming. So obviously the goal is always to control the decibel level, but it's 10 times better to yell and to scream than to remain silent. Because when one party in a relationship remains silent, the other party simply, bless you, does not know how to interpret that silence. And remember, what ends up happening is, when people don't know how to interpret something, we'll say, what do? When people don't know how to interpret something, what do? Right? They interpret it some way. In other words, no one leaves things uninterpreted. So they're going to interpret it, and it really runs the risk of misinterpreting that silence. Therefore, in our relationship dynamics, even in difficult times, it's so much more important to engage with verbal communication than to withdraw into silence. So the Gemara goes right there. Kid Rabba, Dama Rabba, Hektish Shalomi Das. So we'll say ultimately this reflects the view of Rabba, that ultimately again, Hektish Shalomi Das. By the way, it looks at the last line in Rashi, literally the last phrase on the page. Behektish like alamemer shalomi das, the dashchina ika hilchach kidehedyot midas dami. Hektish shalomi das kehedyot midas dami. We'll say any case of hektish shalomi das, in other words, usage of something without the knowledge of the Beis Hamikdash, is the equivalent ultimately again to using something that belongs to an individual with das. So we'll say top of Chaf Aleph 21a, first line. Shalach li Rabbi Abba bar Zabda lemari bar mar. So we'll say we're still with our same question. Zenene v'zelo chaser. One party is getting benefit from the property of the other, but the property owner is not losing. He's not losing. Right? There's no loss to him. So is the benefiter? Yeah, benefiter, right? Ultimately, again, Ruvain is a benefiter, the guy getting benefit. Is he obligated to go ahead and pay? So here we go. So, Shalach le Rabbi Abba bar Zabda Mari bar Mar, by name Rav Huna, Hadar b'chatz cher shlomi daito. If you live, Ruvain lives in Shimon's chatz without Shimon's knowledge. Sarech lalos lo schar o lo. Same question over and over. Does Ruvain have to pay rent or not? Adahachi nach nafshe de Rav Huna. Now we'll say this question was asked to Rav Huna, and ultimately, again, before Rav Huna got a chance to answer it, he died. Amarle Rabba bar Rav Huna. So Rabba bar Rav Huna, Rabba his son said, so Hachi Amar Abba Mari Mishmei de Rab. This is what my father, my teacher, said in the name of Rav. I will say, by the way, just you see something beautiful over here as well. What's the goal of every single father? The goal of every single father? That my son should be able to call me Abba Mari. right? Again, I always say, not out of covet, but I always want my children to feel, right? Our children will have many rebbeim in life. But halavai, we should be zochah that our children should feel that we, their father, is their primary teacher in life. Doesn't, by the way, have to be of Torah. It could just be of life in general. That's the goal. How do you know if you've been a successful parent? If your child is able to turn to and call you Abba and Mari. So incredible. So Rabba quotes his father. He says, Abba Mari Mishmei Derav, Eino tzarech lalos lo schar. You don't have to pay. Ze nene v'ze lo chaser. Ultimately, again, no obligation to pay. Furthermore, Vasocher bayis mi Ruvain. Now I will say, now the Gemara is giving again in the name of Rav a definitive ruling in the name of Rav. We'll see what the halacha l'may says in just a little bit. Furthermore, Vasocher bayis mi Ruvain, and if one rents a home from Ruvain, ma l'schar l'Shimon, he pays rent to Shimon. Huh? The Gemara says, Shimon, maya viditehachi. What is Shimon? What are you doing here? Right? In other words, what are you talking about? You rent a home from Reuben and you pay to Shimon? What does that even mean? So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamma. This is what it means to say. Listen to this. Nimsa habayis shel Shimon, ma'ale lo schar. Alright, so we'll say this is actually interesting. Apparently, if you rent a home from Reuben, and it turns out to actually be what? The house of Shimon, whatever, small misunderstanding, right? So Lamaisa, you pay the rent to Shimon. So the Gemara says, Tarti, I don't understand. These two things seem to be inherently contradictory. Look at Rashi. Tarti, B'tmiya kolomar Tarti mili kamar desasrun adadi. Dahai desachar bayis Shimon miruvein havele dar bechatzer Shimon shalomi da Shimon. So we'll say, so now watch this. The case of where I rented the house from Ruvain, but it turns out it wasn't Ruvain's house. Who was it? It was Shimon's house. Shimon had no idea. Why did Shimon have no idea? Because A, Shimon doesn't live there, and B, Shimon doesn't rent it out. What is that a case of? Zenene v'zelo chaser. And yet, in that case, the Gemara says that what? You have to pay Shimon. So that says Zenene v'zelo chaser is chayiv. But in the immediately previously line, what did you say? Zenene v'zelo chaser is pater. So the Gemara says, Tarti, you just gave two rulings that contradict each other. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not a contradiction. Had the kaimel igra, had the lo kaimel igra. Very simple resolution. I will say, in the first statement where it says that zenene v'zelo chaser, that's your pater, that's talking about a non-rental property. The owner of that property doesn't rent it out. Therefore, again, when Reuven lives in Shimon's property, Reuven is not causing any loss to Shimon. In the second case, where Reuven rented a property from, we'll just use different names. Reuven rented his property from Shimon, but it turns out that's what? It belongs to Levi. That is a case of a rental property. That is Levi's rental property, and therefore, again, Reuven did potentially cause Levi a loss. That's why he has to go ahead and pay him rent. Incredible. Itmar nami Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avin Amar Rav. Formerly Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avin Amar Rav Huna Hadar b'chatzer Chavei Shlomi Daito. If you live in your friend's chatzer, Reuven lives in Shimon's chatzer without his knowledge. Einot tzarich lalos lo schar. You don't have to pay him rent. Meaning what? Zenene v'ze lo chaser. Zenene v'ze lo chaser. Ultimately, again, you're not obligated. I will say, again, just to be clear, right? I know you know this, I'm just going to say it. What's the case? We're going to see this in the Shulchan Aruch in just a moment. What's the case? It's not the pshat, right? That I go over to Reuven and say, Reuven, here's the deal. You're not renting that house anyway. Right? It's sitting vacant. I'm moving in. And Reuven says, no, you're not. And I say, I just came back from Daf Shir. Yes, I am. Right? I learned the sugya, I'm moving in. Well, so remember again, these are ex post facto cases, right? These are cases where Reuven moves into Shimon's property, and then it's discovered that Reuven's living there. Obviously, once it's discovered and Shimon says, get out, then what's the halacha? You get out. The shaila is, Reuven's been living there for a year. He's living there for a year. Is he obligated to pay for the rentals for the year? That's the shaila. Right, that halacha in no way is saying, right, no one ever has a right to go ahead and encroach on someone else's property just because someone's not doing something with that. Right? You haven't used that vacation house in 3 years, right? I'm coming in, I'm taking it over. Right? Obviously, in halacha, no such right like that exists. It's discovered afterwards that Reuven's been living in Shimon's property. Again, for Shimon, it hasn't caused him a loss because he doesn't rent it, he doesn't use it, so it's not the big deal. But now, ex post facto, is he obligated to pay for it? Okay, let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, so listen to this case. Another statement. So again, so once again we see if you live in someone's property and the owner of the property doesn't use it, is not renting it, you're not obligated to pay rent. Furthermore, it says, but then it says that if you rent a home from the residents of the city, and right, you do have to go ahead and pay rent to the owner. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? What owners are we talking about over here? If it turns out that you rented a home from people in the city, but they're not the real owners, and then you find out who the owner is, ma'alin la and schar, you have to pay them. Once again, the Gemara says tarti. That's two contradictory rulings. The first ruling says is not chayiv, but then the second case seems to indicate that you are chayiv. To which again the Gemara says ha kaima la agra. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So ha kaima la agra, ha dal kaima la agra. Same answer. Well, so what do we make a distinction? We make a distinction between Shimon's property that's available for rent and Shimon's property that's not available for rent. If Shimon's property is available for rent, then Einach Inami, when Reuven lives there rent-free, that represents a loss to Shimon. And therefore Reuven would be obligated to pay. But in a case where Shimon does not rent out the property, Reuven, although he lived there rent-free, would not be obligated to pay. Incredible. So also let's go back to Amrav Schora, Amrav Huna, Amrav. Hadar b'chatz chaver shalom idaito, ein sarech la'los lo schar. Nabosei, the Gemara kicks it up a level. And the Gemara says, you're right, Nabosei, the last two, so I just want to point out, we see where the Gemara is heading, in its opinion, is zenene, v'ze'eno chaser, is pater. Is pater. That's where we seem to be heading over here. Again, I will say, but remember, what is zenana means Reuven is benefiting because he's living in Shimon's chaser. And why is it Eino chaser for Shimon? Because it's a dormant property. Shimon doesn't live in it. Shimon doesn't rent it. So therefore, again, and we're assuming also there's no wear and tear on the property. However, we're ensuring that. Right? So Lamaisa, then Reuven would be pater. Watch this, Rabbi say. Now, Rav Schor says, Rav Huna. The truth is, yes. If you live in your friend's property without his knowledge, you do not have to pay him for the use of the property. Rabbi say, now watch this. Mishum shenemar v'shaya yukas shar. Desolation or emptiness causes damage. This is so the Gemara over here quotes the pasuk from Yeshaya. Ushiya yukas shar. Literally, again, when something is desolate, ultimately, now we'll say now it's actually interesting. Rashi says, "Shenamar ushiya yukas shar shade sheshmo shiya mekases shar." Apparently, I will say shadim inhabit unoccupied homes. Right, vacant homes. Say, I will say, interestingly enough, Salach Lamaisa, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, if actually you go and you live in someone's vacant home, you're actually doing them a favor. Only Jews could do this, right? Reuven can say, Shimon, by the way, I don't want to bring it up, but I think you owe me money, right? In other words, I did you an incredible tova, right? So this is interesting. So in other words, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that halacha lamaisa zenene v'zelo chaser doesn't have to pay, because in reality, the Reuven who's living in the chaser of Shimon is actually providing a service by ensuring that the home is not vacant, and again protecting it from shadim. Apparently, again, shadim actually do actual damage in vacant homes. Amar Mar Baravashi lididi chazile. I actually saw this once, right? I saw a shade in a vacant home. Uminagach kitur, and he was goring just like an ox. All right, incredible. Rabbi Yosef says, Beisa Misva Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef says, look at the Lashon over here. Beisa Misva Yosef, Bayis Shu Miyushav Bediras Bnei Adam Yosef. Yashuvu Kayim Lefi Shadar Mesocho Roan Mashu Tzarch. Now, they said this is beautiful. So remember again, the Gemara beforehand, so Rav Schor is the name of Rav. Rav Schor is the name of Huna, said the name of Rav, that ultimately, again, that when Reuven lives in Shimon's property, that Shimon doesn't live in and Shimon doesn't use, so Reuven is providing, so to speak, a service because the Shadim won't live there. Shadim won't occupy there. Rav Yosef says something interesting. He says something a little bit nuanced, different. He says, Beisa Misva Yosef. Ultimately, again, a home that is lived in is a home that is in order. What does that mean, I was saying? What does that mean? So, when no one lives in the home, if something breaks or something happens, no one is there to see it. right? No one is there to see it. And because no one is there to see it, damage could happen. But a home where someone is living, if something does break, ultimately whatever the issue is, it can be remedied in real time. Beisa Meisva Yosef. My Ben will say, so they both seem to be saying the same things, namely that Reuven is doing a favor, ultimately again for Shimon by living in the home. So the Gemara says, Ika benayhu dekamishhtamish be b'tzivi v'tivna. So we'll say it makes the following difference. Let's say Shimon uses the home as a storehouse. So in terms of shadim, once it's used as a storehouse, which means episodically or occasionally people will be there, then ultimately again, then halacha l'maisa, we take care of the shadim issue. But if it's an issue about seeing stuff that breaks, if it's used as a storehouse, the truth is Shimon may not see that stuff breaks. Okay, very interesting. I'll say, I'll point out over here, there's I think an incredible metaphorical significance in this as well. Rabbi Yosef's statement, Beisa Misva Yosef. If the home is occupied, if someone is home, so the home will be in a good state. You know, Rabbi saying, whenever you see bias doesn't just mean home, right? Bias is often also a metaphor for a person. Right? We see it specifically, right? The Gemara says, we saw it in Gittin, Miyamai lo karasi li ishti, I never called my wife, right? Karasi li ishti beisi, I called my wife my home, right? Not a house, right? A very, very, very important distinction, right? So I both say, so I call, right? So you see that a person is called a home, which again, there's a lot of symbolism in that, obviously, because just like a home has different parts to it, people have different parts to them. Just like a home, ultimately, again, is supposed to be a place that welcomes other people. So too, I am supposed to be the kind of person who welcomes all other kinds of people as well. There's a lot of symbolism there. But I will say about the slushing over here, I will say if you look at the person as a home, just like a home, we'll say, right, needs constant upkeep. I will say, what happens every single home project, right? You begin to do something in your house. What happens with every single home project? Oh, it's just me? I thought my wife told me this happens to everyone, right? So again, you start with one thing, and then what ends up happening is, oh, you start with this, let's do this, and let's do this. And by the way, meaningful good things. When you begin to introspect into the house, you begin to see that there's a lot to do. So I will say, it's the same thing with people. It's the same thing with the self. At the end of the day, a lot of people live life and they're never home. They're always distracted. They're always doing something else. They're never attentive. And because they're never attentive, stuff is in a state of disrepair in the house, in the personalistic house, and they never tend to it. And you know what happens when stuff is broken in the house and you don't tend to it? It just breaks further and further and further. And then this thing breaks and that thing breaks. I'll say, if you want to be successful in life, you got to be home. You have to be present in the house. You have to be present in your life. You have to be present in yourself. You can't live life always distracted by the myriad of distractions that always take our attention away from the things we need to be focused on. If you're not at home, if you're not resigning, if you're not attentive, if you're not introspective into your personalistic home, stuff breaks and your home falls into a state of disrepair. The mantra of the Jews, Rav Yosef, Beisa Misva Yosef. I'm going to be present in my home. It's a good lesson in family also, but I'm going to be present in my personalistic home, attentive to the things that are going on inside of me, and if something does fall into a state of disrepair, I'm going to jump right on it and fix it. Incredible. So now it goes weiter. Hu gavra. The bana apagno al kilkalosa diasmi. Well, it's an interesting case. So there was a guy. This guy built a mansion. Apparently, he will see what happens, whether he bought or he took a piece of property. There was a garbage dump that was owned by Yisomim, by orphans, and this guy built a mansion on it. Agbe Rav Nachman la'apanamir. Rav Nachman took the mansion. He repossessed the mansion. Leima kasav Rav Nachman adar b'chatz chaver shlomi daito tzarach la'alos lo schar. So I'll say, so apparently this guy bought his mansion on this garbage dump. Now the Yisomim, just kind of like the Yisomim weren't, it was like a landfill. The Yisomim weren't using the property. So the guy figured the Yisomim aren't using the property anyway. What's the big deal? Let me just build a mansion on top of it. So what happened? So Rav Nachman took possession of the mansion. Took possession of the mansion, changed the locks. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? So we'll say, what do you see from here? Rav Nachman clearly holds that Allah l'maisa zenene v'ze'ino chaser is chayiv. Is chayiv, right? Again, Reuven, the guy who built the mansion, is nana. The orphans themselves, again, are lo chaser because they weren't using the landfill anyway. But you see that shechayiv. To which the Gemara says, no. Home kara karmenai havudari bay v'yavlo liasmi davar muat. No, that's not what happened. What happened is actually the mansion guy kicked off the people who were living there. There were these karmenoim. That's their name. That was the name of a place. Karmenoim, and they paid rent to the Yisum, a small amount, but they paid rent. It was a rental income. This guy came in, dispossessed the Kamma and built his mansion. So Rav Nachman said to the mansion guy, Amrle, Zil Painasino Liasmi. Listen, I'll let you keep the mansion, but you gotta do good by the Yisum. In other words, you have to somehow compensate them for the fact that you're using their land. V'lo ashkach. And the mansion guy would not listen. He would not listen, and therefore, Agbe Rav Nachman lapad nemine. As a result, Rav Nachman went ahead and took back the mansion, or took away the mansion. So that was the case. So Rabbi say, how do we paskin? How do we paskin? So I will say, so this is incredible. So first, let me just read you the Rambam. Two very quick halachas. But I will say, I just want to point out, it's not my fault that we're behind. The dapim are unusually long. Take this up with the editor of the Shas. I'm doing my best. Well, so listen to this. So two interesting halachas. Number one, Rambam Hilchos Gzela Va'aveda Perek Gimel Halacha Tes. One line. Hadar bechatzer chaver shalomi daito. Reuven lives in Shimon's property without his knowledge. So ultimately, again, the Rambam says, Im osa chatzer eina suyi l'schar, eina tzarch lahalos lo schar. Again, as long as it's not a rental property, Shimon doesn't live in this property, Shimon doesn't rent this property, it is a case of Zenene v'ze'ino chaser. What's the halacha? You don't have to pay. Shezenene v'ze'ino chaser. So we'll say that's how the Rambam paskins. So therefore, in our case over here, right, Reuven is living in Shimon's property. Shimon doesn't do it. It's a dormant property. Shimon finds out that Reuven is living in the property. Shimon could say get out. Right? But lamaisa. So and Reuven, and obviously at that point when Shimon says get out, Reuven has to vacate the property. But Reuven would not be obligated to pay rent because again we paskin Zenana v'ze eino chaser is potter. The Shulchan Aruch says the same thing as well in Choshen Mishpat. Simin Shin Samech Gimel Sif Vav. I'm going to leave this for now. Shulchan Aruch is great. It is a fantastic piece of Shulchan Aruch with some additional nuances, but we'll leave it for now. But at least you know now the halacha l'maisa. If we have time at the end of the shir, I'm sure we're going to have plenty of time at the end of the shir. Emirat Hashem, I'll come back to that. Otherwise, again, I'll send out that Mara Makam on the chat. Let's go right there. Says Gemara, Te'etzem Mishalas Mashanenis. So here we go. Now the Mishnah said, we're talking about Shane. So we'll say, so remember again, Shane, what's the halach of Shane in Rishus Harabim? Shane Rishus Harabim? Potter. Now, the Mishnah spoke about the following. The Mishnah said, however, even though you're potter for Shane, the owner still has to pay for the benefit the animal receives. Right? We spoke about this because at the end of the day, the owner, for example, saved money. He doesn't have to feed his animals, or his animal. So the Maisa now you do have to pay for what you benefited. Now watch this. So the way the Mishnah framed it was mitoch harachava. If the animal's walking on the road in Rishus Harabim, right, and it ate something, so the owner pays whatever the animal benefited from. If, however, again, the animal goes in and consumes from mitzide harachava, from the sides of the road, mishalemes mashe zika, you pay damages. Right? So we'll say, so let's analyze this. So the Gemara says, Keitzad mishalemes mashe. So Amarav, I'm sorry, let me read the rest. Yeah, good, that's it, fine. So Amarav, Rav says, this is incredible. Rav says, Obe michazeres. We're talking about a case over here where the animal turns its head. So the animal's walking to Shusarabim, turns its head, and consumes food on the side of the Rishus Harabim. Take a look at Rashi in just a moment. Arav, or Mechazeres. It's right across in Tosos Mi Pesach. Mechazeres Rosha Merachava Litzida Shal Rachava Va'achla Peros Katani Maslisin the Mishalemis Mashe Zika Afagav the Kula Kaima. So we'll say, now listen to this. Now the Gemara is suggesting is as follows. That Allah L'maisa, Rav says, if the animal is walking and eats food that's straight in front of it, that's called Shein Birshus Harabim, and therefore ultimately, again, one will be pater. But if the animal turns its head and eats ultimately again, then the owner is obligated to pay that which the animal damaged. Shmuel says, no, afilu mechazeres nami pater. Ultimately again, he holds that Allah, because according to Rav, that would be called the case of shein rishus hanizak or shein rishus hayachid, right? That would be a different kind. That's not essentially. It's not called shein rishus harabim. Shmuel says no. That's still called shein rishus harabim. Why? Because the body of the animal is still in rishus harabim. So according to Shmuel, ultimately again, what would be a case of chiyuv? To which the Gemara says, Kigon deshav kasa l'rechava va'azluk v'kama b'tzidi rechava. The case of chiyuv would be where what? Where the animal leaves rishus harabim and kind of goes to the side, right? Goes to the side. Shabbos say that's abnormal. That's not like a normal situation. Normally the animal just continues on the road. If the animal goes out of its way to eat on the side of the road, then einach inami you'd be chayav for damages. Others explain this statement kind of as a self-standing statement. What happens if the animal is walking in Rosh Hashanah, doesn't eat from food in front of it, instead turns its head and eats from its side? Rav Amar Chayeves, Rav says you're chayev for damages. Ushmuel Arpatur, Shmuel says you're patur. Shmuel Mishamas Mashe Zika Heichim Mishkachasla. So according to Shmuel, where do you find the case where the owner has to pay for damages? The Gemara says Kigon the Shavka l'Rechava va'Azla v'Kamma b'Tzidei Rechava. It would be a case ultimately where the animal leaves the primary he leaves the primary Shusram and what Rabbi say, and he goes ahead and goes to the side of the Shusram. That would be a case where we chayav for damages. Master Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, so Rav Nachman Yitzchak raised the kasha. He said, "Mi Pesach hachanos mishavas mashenernis." So let's listen to this. So if the animal sticks its head into the entranceway of a store, ultimately, again, then Rabbi say then the animal has to pay for what it benefited. From what it benefited. So the Gemara says, well, one second. As opposed to what it damaged. The Gemara says, Heichim Mishkachasla. And I will say, now, Bepashtos, a store is what? A store is always the case where what? The animal turns its head. And yet you're seeing that ultimately, again, you're chayiv to pay for what you benefited from. No, Mishkachasla. The Gemara says, I'm sorry. So, Heichim Mishkachasla, Pshit B'machazeres. It must be a case where the animal turns its head. The Ka'amar, Mashenernis. And you have to pay ultimately, again, for what you benefited. Mashenernis in Mashe Zigalo. From what you benefited, but not from what you damaged. To which the Gemara says, "Who most of them? Who afarikla?" He answers it, no. The Kamma b'Karen Zavis. We're talking actually about a store. You can actually see it's the picture in Rashi. The way the store is the store itself actually extends a little bit into Rosh Hashanah, so that when the animal eats from the store, the animal is actually walking. So if you could imagine in the image in Rashi, the animal is walking on the right side, right, or depending where you're coming from. I'm looking from the Mavoi Katan into the Mavoi Gadol, right, and I'm riding on the right side, and therefore it puts its head into the store. But remember, again, it's putting its head into the store how? Straight ahead. Straight ahead, there's no turning. Others say, everyone agrees, I will say that Allah when the animal turns its head, ultimately again, there is no chiyuv. I'm sorry, everyone agrees you are chayiv. Ki pligi, and we say chayiv, we'll say chayiv. Ki pligi, b'mikhatze mokom mirashuso l'rishus harabim. So we'll say, where does the shaila come up? We'll say, let's say the following case. Let's say Ruvain has a field that directly abuts the rishus harabim. And then what does he do? But he really doesn't use the edge of his field that directly abuts, but rather he withdraws a little bit further into the field. Now what happens, I will say? But it's still his property. Ruvain put fruit on the edge of his field, the part of his field that abuts the Rosh Hashanah. But again, to be clear, like if you look, Ruvain put the wall of his chatzar, he pulled it in a little bit. So the fruit is on an area of his chatzar that is his property, abuts the Rosh Hashanah, but that he doesn't really use in a normal way. Now what happens? So Shimon's animal comes and eats fruit from that area. So we'll say, what's the halacha? So Rav says, Lo shanu ella machazeres aval mekatze makom mirshusa l'sharabim ptura. So Rav said Rav says the only time that shechayev is when the animal turns its head. But lamais again, if the animal goes into an area, right, that ultimately is technically personal property, but the owner kind of pulled back. So therefore, kind of by default, it's become part of Rishus Harabim. Rav is going to say there's no chiyuv for shein, because that's still called shein done b'Rishus Harabim. Shmuel says, Shmuel says, no, not only are you chayiv for mechazeres, right, for turning the head, but you're also chayiv, again, if the animal eats that produce in Ruvain's property, because at the end of the day, what? It's still Rishus HaYachid. The fact that Reuven pulled back his wall and doesn't really use it, l'maaseh also your property is still your property. It's still called shein b'Rishus HaYachid, and therefore you'll be chayiv. Lema bebar b'Rishus HaKamiflagi. Say perhaps that they are arguing about in the case of bar b'Rishus. Then about say we'll just do this case quickly. Yeah, very quickly. So we'll say, so listen to this. So the case will say, Bar b'Rishus means I have property. I go ahead and I dig a pit in my property, which I am allowed to do. And then I'll say, then what happens? Then halacha l'maisa, I'm mafkir my property. I make my property hefker, but I still have ownership over the bar. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, the Rav Amar Pater. Rav says ultimately, again, I'm Pater for any damages. Kasavar bar b'Rishus chayiv. Ultimately, I will say, let me say differently. When Rav says Pater, ultimately, again, what that means is that halacha l'maisa, if my animal does any damage, ultimately, again, I'll be Pater. Why? Because he holds bar b'Rishus chayiv. That ultimately, when you have a bar in your domain, you're chayiv. Shmuel says chayiv, kasavar bar b'Rishus pater. So which the Gemara says that's not the case. Amar l'charav, that is not the case at all. The olam emalacha. In reality, I would tell you, say Amud Beis ba'alma bar b'Rishus pater. Really, in the case, ultimately, again, I will say the only case of bar that you are chayiv for is bar b'Rishus harabim. You're not chayiv for bar b'Rishus hayachid. V'shayni hacha. This case is different. Why? The Amar lav kol kaminach the mekarves lula perosacha l'Rishus harabim u'mechayves lula Torah. Both say, listen to this. In this case over here, where Ruvain, right? So also remember again, Ruvain has a property that abuts the Rishus Harabim. And what happens? But he pulls in, right? He pulls in. So at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, he's like moved in his wall, but he's now putting his fruit at the edge of his field. So I, the owner of the animal, who then goes and eats the fruit in Ruvain's field, says Ruvain, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't put produce so close to Rishus Harabim and expect that my animal is not going to consume it. That is an unfair expectation, and therefore, again, really, you're what's the word? You're negligent. Yeah, you're the one who's negligent, because what are you doing? Your property abuts your. Even you didn't put your wall at the border of your field, right? You pulled your wall in. So you pulled your wall in, and now you're putting produce at the edge of the field. Come on, you can't make me liable for the fact that my animal now came along and ate that produce. The Shmuel says, no, bi'alma bar b'Rishus. In reality, ultimately, again, in a case of a bar in my property where I was mafkir the sada, chayiv. The bishlam bar ikalamemar lav adaita. Because we'll say in the case of a bar, ultimately again, in the case of a bar, one could say the animal didn't see the bar. Ela peiros mi ikalamemar lav adaiti hachazilahu. Both say no. The fruit is something visible, and I, as the owner of the animal, have an obligation to steer the animal away. I lema machzeres tanahi. We'll say maybe the whole case of machzeres. So we'll say, here, just to be clear, what we know. What we know is like this: that halacha l'maisa, when the animal goes ahead and is walking in Rishus Harabim and eats food in front of it, everyone agrees. What is that called? What is that called? That's called shein b'Rishus Harabim. And what's the liability? Zero. Pater. The interesting shaila is what happens when the animal turns its head and goes and eats like that. Is that called still shein b'Rishus Harabim or not? So the Gemara says, "Lema machzeres, tanahi tisanya ha'ochel mitoch harachava." If one goes ahead and eats from the road, Rechava literally means like from the middle of Rishus Harabim, Mishalemis Mashenenis. So we'll say, so remember again, even when you're potter on shein b'Rishus Harabim, remember what? Remember, you're still chayiv to pay for what you benefited, right? So ultimately, Mitzidei Harachava, and if the animal eats from the sides of the Rishus Harabim, Mishalemis Mashezika, you pay for damages. Now we'll say why? Because the sides of the Rishus Harabim will really have the status of what? Will have the status of Rishus Birshus HaYachid, and therefore again it will be considered to be Shein Birshus HaNizak. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Huda, so the Gemara is Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Yosef Elazar Omrim, Ein Darko Lechol Ela Lahalich. Ultimately, it is not the derech of an animal to eat, rather it's the derech of an animal to walk. Rabbi Yosef and Tana Kamma, Rabbi Yosef is saying Tana Kamma, Ella Machrezes Ika Beinai. Rather, you have to say the case of Machrezes is the fundamental distinction. Tana Kamma Savar Machrezes Nai Mishali Mashanenis. Tana Kamma holds when the animal turns its head and eats, still that's called Shein Birshus Harabim, and therefore you only have to pay for what you benefited from. Rabbi Yosef Savar Mishlamis Mashe Zika. Rabbi Yosef says no. Machrezes, Rabbi Yosef, when the animal turns its head and eats, that's considered to be Shein Birshus HaNizak in a damaged party's property, and therefore halacha l'maisa you have to pay total damages. Rabbi Yossi Savar Mishalemis. I'm sorry. Tanakam Savar Mecharez Nai Mishalemis Mashenenis. Rabbi Savar Mishalemis Mashe Zika. Tushimar says lo. Dechuli Ama Machrezes Ikarav Ikushmuel. In reality, Rabbi say Machrezes is a machlokes. I keep saying Machrezes. Machzeres is a machlokes, right? When the animal turns its head and consumes, that is going to be a machlokes. Again, machlokes Rabbi Shmuel. B'hacha be'bir b'stei achar kamiflagi. I will say, what's their machlokes? Their machlokes, I will say, remember again, Shein is only chayiv in personal property. Right? Shein is only chayiv b'shus hanizak. Why? Because the way the Torah frames Shein is ubir b'stei acher. So watch this. What's the machlokes? Mar savar ubir b'stei acher v'lo b'shus harabim. One opinion says bir b'stei acher means it has to be in someone else's field and not in b'shus harabim. Umar savar ubir b'stei acher v'lo b'shus hamazik. I'm sorry, Umar, sorry. First opinion says Bir B'stei Acher means personal property and not public property. The other opinion says Bir B'stei Acher v'lo b'rshus hamazik. Rabbi say, but Shein that happens in the damager's property, you're not chayiv. The Gemara says, damager's property. So the Gemara says b'rshus hamazik leima peracha b'rshusei my body. Rabbi say, of course, if damage happens in a damager's property, right? So in other words, what that means is, I'm in my property. Reuven comes and brings a basket of fruit. He puts it down. My animal eats his fruit. Of course, Reuven can't sue me for damages. I can say, Reuven, who told you to bring your fruit in? So the Gemara says, Leima peirecha bershusi my boy. What is your fruit doing here? Ella di ilfa v'raboshia ike bener. Rather, you have to say that rather it's the statements ultimately again of ilfa and raboshia. What did ilfa and raboshia talk about? Rabosai, look at Rashi. Di ilfa raboshia. Damar ilfa le'el behema shepashtat savara ba'achla me'al gabe chaberta chayeves. With raboshia, remember again we had this machlokes. If an animal eats off the back of another animal, or an animal puts its hind legs up on the back of another animal and consumes like that, is that called Shein Birshus Hanizak or not? That's a fundamental machlokes. Rabbi say, how do we paskin? I'm sorry, I know we did that quickly. Rabbi say, but this is an interesting case. Let's go with what we know. In order for you to be chayiv for Shein, where does Shein have to take place? Birshus hanizak, right? In the property of the damaged party. That's where Shein has to be, right? And therefore, again, Shein Birshus harabim, everyone is going to agree, you're pater. Now, we'll say, so let's play this out. So now my animal is walking on Birshus harabim. My animal eats from food in front of it. What's the halacha? Pater. Now again, is it complete p'tur? No, what do you have to do? You have to pay mishalemes mashenenis. So this is very important. What is it mishalemes? Remember, this is yesterday's daf. If I had to feed my animal straw, which is like the most very, it would cost me $150. Okay, so now I don't have to give my animal dinner tonight because the animal ate someone else's produce. I pay $150. That's ultimately again what I benefited from. Now we'll say, what's the shaila? The shaila ultimately again is if the animal turns its head. And essentially, the animal turning its head represents this idea that the body of the animal is situated in Rishus Harabim, but ultimately again, consumption is occurring outside of the main thoroughfare. Isn't that fascinating? Outside of the main thoroughfare. So that's the shaila. Is that still called Shein Birshus Harabim, and therefore you're pater? Or is that maybe that's actually called Shein Birshus Hanizak, and therefore ultimately again, you would be chayiv. So listen to the Rambam. Hilchos Niskei Mammon, Perek Gimel, Halacha Tes, here it is. Behema, Sha'achla mitoch harachava. An animal eats produce, obviously someone else's produce. on the street, where the animal's walking, the animal stopped walking, doesn't matter. Mishalim mashenanis. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, the animal, right, the owner only has to pay the value of the benefit it got. That's the halacha. Watch this, get ready, here it is, get ready for it. Vafilu chazra al tzidi harachava va'achla mehen. Even in a case of machazeres. Machazeres, even if the animal kind of veers off to the sides of the Rishus Harabim, that's still called Shein Rishus Harabim. Rishus Harabim is Rishus Harabim is Rishus Harabim. Now watch this. He says, no, I'm sorry, no, I said that wrong. Even if the animal, go back, even if the animal vafilu chazra al tzidi. Chazra means that it turned its head and ate from the side of the Rishus Harabim. You are pater. In other words, as long as the body of the animal is situated in Rishus Harabim proper, whether the animal eats from what is front of it or turns its head and eats on the side, that's fine. Now, here it is. You ready for it? Here it is. However, aval, im hinichas harachava, v'halcha v'amda b'tzidi harachava, v'achla mishalim mashehezika. Oh, but if the animal leaves the primary Rishus Harabim and literally again relocates itself to the side, to the corners, right, to the side of the Rishus Harabim, then what Rabbi say? Then in that case, that's considered to be Shein Birshus Hanizak, and therefore you have to pay full damages. In other words, Rabbi saying, the chap with this, we've actually seen this before back in our Shabbos days, and we really have to stop. But back in our Shabbos days, Rabbi saw this, that there's a distinction between the primary Rishus Harabim and the secondary Rishus Harabim. There's a difference between the two. The secondary Rishus Harabim has many elements like a Rishus Yachas. Rabbi says essentially, the way the Rambam Paskins is like this: if the animal eats produce in the Rishus Harabim, whether again it's produce in front of it or it just turns its head to eat, that's called Shein Rishus Harabim, and therefore pater. If the animal leaves primary Rishus Harabim, and therefore all the owner has to pay is whatever benefit it got. However, if halacha l'maisa, the animal itself actually goes ahead and leaves primary Rishus Harabim and goes over to tzidei Rishus Harabim and eats over there, then Rabbi say there's going to be complete obligation for damages. Rabbi say, shkoyach, stop over for today. Mirat Hashem, tomorrow we'll pick up at the Mishnah, another incredible Mishnah. Shkoyach, everyone. Again, in Mirat Hashem, breakfast is served, breakfast and beginning of Shir Mirat Hashem in the base medrash. Please join us.